Welcome again to the Trainer podcast, in which I try to bridge a gap between science and practice and science. And today we're talking about a very important topic, at least here in Europe, but I think also in the States. That is de-escalation. What is it? Does it really work? Is there any research? And who better to talk with than Robin Engel, Ph.D. She recently joined the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at the Ohio State University as a senior research scientist following over 25 years in academic positions at the University of Cincinnati. Is that correct?
That's
Correct
correct.
pronouncement? In the
Uh-huh.
Pennsylvania State University. You did a lot of research, great articles about de-escalation training, like titles like "Does de-escalation training really works?" and the deafening silence about de-escalation training. I was really inspired. And from 2015 to 2019, you served as a vice president for safety and reform at University of Cincinnati, where her role included executive oversight of university public safety operations and successful development and implementation of a comprehensive police reforms for the University of Cincinnati Police Division in the aftermath of a fatal officer-involved shooting of an unarmed motorist off campus. Previous positions also include Director of the International Associations of Chiefs of Police, Center for Police Research and Policy, and Senior Vice President at the National Policing Institute. Well, there is a lot more to say about your biography. I will put it in the show notes. But I saw you first with all your great work about de-escalation training. Is that correct?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
actually. And I came to the to working in and around de-escalation training and better understanding it as part of my role you had mentioned as the Vice President of Safety and Reform at the University of Cincinnati. So just to give you a little context, if you can
Yeah.
imagine, so I'm a professor by training,
Yeah.
and I've worked with police my entire career, but I'm not a sworn officer. So at the University of Cincinnati, we have campus law enforcement officers that are
Mm.
sworn law enforcement officers. They carry guns. They go out into not just our campus area, but also into the neighborhood, and they're authorized to use force. And we had a situation where one of those campus law enforcement officers shot and killed an unarmed motorist.
Aha.
And the moment that that happened, this was in 2015, the university came to me and said, "What should we do?" And I created for them a whole short-term, long-term plan. This is how we handle the immediate crisis. But here's what we need to do for police reform moving forward. This is an agency that's been deeply neglected, have to look at our policies, procedures, our supervision, and our training. And the university officials at that time said, "Great, we want you to do it." And I looked a little confused and said, "Do what? I'm a researcher. I'm just telling you what the plan should be." And they said, "Well, who better to implement that plan than you?" And I thought about it for a couple of hours, and literally overnight, I became the vice president for safety and reform at the University of Cincinnati, overseeing this police department. And I have to tell you, the cops were not thrilled about it because
Okay.
imagine if you're a police
Yeah.
officer and suddenly, and you've had this very traumatic incident that's happened, people are calling for the police department to be disbanded, and the university's response is to put a researcher in charge.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but that's how I started thinking about training, and in particular, use of force training in a much more systematic way. So I did that work with the University of Cincinnati Police Division for over 3 years.
Hmm.
We had great success. It was never easy. It was a lot of work to rebuild trust in our community and to rebuild that police department, but we did have great success. And as part of that, I became very interested in better understanding, testing, and using de-escalation training. So that's how I came into this space.
Okay. And what did you found about the current state of de-escalation training? And
Sure, sure. Well, again, I'll take you back to 2015
yeah.
when I started. In 2014 in the United States, we had had a very controversial officer use of force in Ferguson, Missouri, that led to a lot of protests and, of course, even internationally protests about police abuse and use of force. So coming off the heels of that, there was a real big push in the United States to have de-escalation training for officers. But truly, at the time, nobody even knew really what that meant. The
Mm.
term de-escalation was never well defined. The training itself, what belongs in a de-escalation training, no, there was no consistency. And there was a concern among law enforcement officers that you're going to teach me to hesitate and I'm going to get killed out there.
Yeah.
Right? Remember that the US, of course, we have a gun culture here,
Yeah.
right? And so a hesitation by a law enforcement officer when you have an armed citizenry can mean life or death.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't an overreaction by officers to say, you're going to give us training and teach us to, time, distance, cover, try to, use conflict resolution skills. And the other, that maybe that works, but maybe it doesn't. And no one knew
Mm.
whether or not it worked. So
Mm.
here I am now, a police executive, and I have to make a decision for my men and women in uniform and our community about whether or not to go with untested training, hoping that it has impact in a positive way, but knowing it could go the other way and really cause more harm. And so we moved forward with what we thought were the best practices.
Yeah.
But then we also tested them along the way so that no other
Yeah.
police executive would be in a space where they didn't know if it worked or not.
Before we go into that, where you went, I've two questions pop up in my head. That is, um, was the how do you call it? Were the sorrows of the officers were they based on their experience that if they
Right.
talked too much, there was danger, and the second part is I they they had to use verbal skills also before they knew what de-escalation was. So, or did they not talk at all?
Well, well, that's a great question. And one of the things that we had to really do in the United States is to explain to officers that the use of de-escalation tactics and skills, with the idea being that you're going to slow situations down. You're going to use time and distance from the person that's in crisis, time, distance, and cover, right? Think
Mhm.
about, how you position yourself or reposition yourself, not retreat necessarily, but reposition yourself. The words we chose really mattered.
Yeah.
The term de-escalation itself in first line officer vernacular really started to have a negative connotation
Hmm.
because citizens and politicians were demanding de-escalation training. And the cops were saying, you don't know what my situation looks like.
Hmm.
And I need to be able to protect myself and others in this situation. And so they were often trained to go in quick
Yeah.
and respond fast to try to reduce the likelihood that the situation would get worse. So this
Yeah.
was a different concept.
Yeah.
Although interesting, it's a concept that was often used by our special teams, our
Yeah.
SWAT teams, right? That's what SWAT teams do, right? Like they
Yeah.
plan it out, they think it through, they talk, they use time, distance, cover, they get a plan, and then they engage. But patrol officers were not used to that. They didn't often have backup or resources readily available. So if they didn't go in and handle things
Yeah.
and it got larger, it blew up on them, then they're really in trouble. So that's why it was a different mindset for
Yeah.
officers to have to do it this way, try something different.
It remembers me of there is a concept called I'm not sure if you know it, the good stranger mindset. The good stranger mindset came from Polish Solutions. Jonathan Wender did some research into it, and it came from Gary Klein and the military, where military personnel overseas the good stranger. So okay, I'm a stranger, but you can trust me, and I have good intentions. And but some people and their research showed that mindset resulted in less, how do you say it, aggression and so on. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So, interestingly, the way that de-escalation training has now evolved in the United States was based off of what folks learned in the UK and in Scotland specifically.
Mm.
So a group came over with the Police Executive Research Forum. This is, again, is like 2014, 2015, somewhere in there. And PERF is what we call it, the Police Executive Research Forum, which I'm not affiliated with PERF, but it was their training that
Yeah.
I then took on at the University of Cincinnati Police Division and then later tested with the Louisville, Kentucky Metro Police Department. But that training was based on what others in Europe were already doing
Mm.
because folks there are more accustomed to suspects having an edged weapon, a
Yeah.
knife, rather than a gun. And we know that in the United States, for approximately 40% of our fatal officer-involved shootings, fatal shootings of suspects, and about 40% of them, those suspects were armed with something less than a firearm,
Yeah.
right? So an edged weapon of some sort, or no weapon at all in some cases. And it was that 40% that folks from the Police Executive Research Forum really felt like we can make a difference here. We just need to learn how to de-escalate situations that don't involve a firearm. That's why they went to the
Mm.
UK and other places around Europe to figure out what those officers were doing and started to model that and bring that back to the US. It's a great example of, that exchange internationally of
Yeah.
learning what practices are the best fit.
Yeah. When I was with the police, we used we used a lot of models. I remember we did some five hard steps or something like that, and something called verbal judo, and there were
Verbal
some
judo.
there
Mhm.
were some programs around. But okay, then you started to explore the topic, and you wrote about it. Does de-escalation really work? And at, at,
Right.
at, at this time, is there a consensus about what de-escalation is?
Well, first, I'm a researcher, so there's never a
No,
consensus in
of course
anything.
not. No.
But
Lovely. Yeah.
what I can tell you, so when we first started looking at it, so again, a position, to kind of give you the where I was in time and history. So I'm leading this agency and I'm going to bring de-escalation training to them. I've changed their use of force policy. And when I say I hired other operational folks.
Yeah.
So it wasn't totally in my charge. Let's
Yeah.
just put
Yeah.
people at ease. It wasn't like a researcher came in and just changed everything. I had operational folks that came with me. Um, but what we were trying to do was pick a de-escalation training that we felt was the strongest. And we chose what's called ICAT, Integrating Communications Assessments and Tactics. That's the
Mm.
PERF, Police Executive Research Forum. That's their training that they had
Uh-huh.
developed after consultation with the Scottish police and others. So we implemented that. And now the good news for me is that our police department, our campus police department, which had about 60 sworn officers or so, the larger Department of Public Safety for the university is about 150 sworn and non-sworn individuals. We had so few uses of force that when we put this training in, the good news is we still had few uses of force, but I couldn't really test what the impact was because there wasn't that much force to begin with. At the same time, 2019 or so a few years go by, the Louisville Metro Police Department, they had over 1,000 officers. And in Louisville, Kentucky, they were going to implement ICAT training department wide. And they allowed us to come in and use what we called a modified randomized control trial. So we randomized which districts got the training first.
Mm-hmm.
And then we compared those districts to themselves, right? Like what it looked like pre-post, but also compared them to the districts that didn't have the training yet when the ones that did. So we looked at it a couple of different ways to be able to evaluate, is this training having impact? And we actually found, contrary to concerns of officers that it would make them less safe, we actually found it made them more safe. In fact, it reduced the likelihood or the use of force 28%.
Mhm.
It reduced citizen injuries 26%. But most important, I think, for really to get buy-in across the country is we found a reduction in officer injuries at 36%. So
Wow.
those that were trained and using those de-escalation tactics and skills were less likely to be injured in the field. And so that was the first time. This is the first study. There were other studies of de-escalation that had been going on about changes in attitudes
Yeah.
and how self-reported behavior, how people felt about the training, but there was nothing that connected it to changes in actual behavior on the street.
Yeah.
So this was the first study that did that. And then everyone kind of started to absorb that information, and then it really took off. Then de-escalation training became more accepted in the US, and it's continuing forward to this day.
And to become really basic, what is de-escalation anyway? What
I
what
know,
what
I
were
know we've
two?
been talking about it all this time, and what does it mean?
Yeah.
Do you know some trainings don't even use the term de-escalation because it
Oh,
has this negative perception in law
mm.
enforcement, right? It started with a negative perception.
Yeah.
So some folks, and in fact, the ICAT training doesn't even use the term de-escalation. They talk
Uh-huh.
about things like conflict resolution.
Uh,
They talk about you know, changing the temperature of encounters, things like that. They use different ways to describe it. But I can tell you, it's policing is not the only field to use this.
well,
And in fact, when we first started studying it, we found that some of the best de-escalators in our professional world are nurses. All right. So in the US, nursing is still predominantly a female profession, although, of course, we have male nurses, but predominantly female. And so if you think about a female that is dealing with people who are in pain, often intoxicated or high on drugs, are in a position where they might not want to be at the hospital, right? And you have to convince those individuals to remain calm, to not interact, in negative ways, and to let people and doctors examine you when you're in pain. So we realized that there are other professions that do this really well. People that work in the mental health field,
yeah.
right? They're really good at de-escalation tactics. So learning from those trainings that were in place and pulling those key concepts. So I'll read for you just a
Yeah.
quick definition here. Most of the field, nursing, psychiatry, etc., they think about and talk about de-escalation as a process to prevent, reduce, or manage aggressive behavior during an interaction between two or more persons.
Yeah.
That's kind of how they think about it. Now, in the policing context, we really kind of extend that to, trying to reduce the use of force during these situations. So when we extend it, a couple of researchers have used this as a definition, bringing a situation or a citizen in crisis back to a calm state using the least amount of force possible. That's Todak and White. They
Oh, yeah.
published that
Yeah.
in 2019. So that's a term that they use. Others across the country, right? There's a very long definition that the International Association of Chiefs of Police has embraced. I'm happy to post all these. They're in some of my writings, just quoting the different aspects of what we mean by de-escalation.
Yeah. So, and it many questions about that. That questions like, is de-escalation, is it something about communication, or can you also use tactics, use of force tactics? Because there were also researchers talking about, if you do it quickly, you also prevent,
Right,
the longer the conflict, the more risk. Can you
right.
elaborate on
Yeah,
that? Yeah.
and so that officer decision-making piece is so critical. right? Because you have to make a decision in real time about the best way to handle this situation. So think about, a situation of an active shooter. That's not a time to de-escalate a situation, right? We know now from terrible, horrible incidents in the US and around the world, for that matter, that these are the types of situations that you need to go in and handle quickly. You should not
Yeah.
be sitting back and trying to de-escalate situations where there's an active shooter, for example. Or a lot of times with any type of firearm that might be involved, you really need to react quickly. But I'm going back again to now, this is the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Yeah.
They have, as part of their definition, they include de-escalation may include the use of such techniques as command presence, uh, advisements, warnings, verbal persuasion, and tactical repositioning.
Yeah.
So they are talking about lots of different tactics and skills that you can use. And the final thing I'll note is that some de-escalation trainings, I know the ICAT one in particular, they actually think about, instead of use of force, as a hierarchical model, where this is the force that you see, so you can use this level of force, and then you can escalate
Hmm.
accordingly. That's how law enforcement was trained in the United States for decades.
Yeah.
What we're thinking about now is what Perf has termed the critical decision-making model. It's a different type of decision-making model. And actually, again, I believe it's modeled after what a lot of work was already going on in Europe and in the UK, where it's a centralized, everything comes back to this critical decision in the middle.
Mm.
So each time you're more likely to de-escalate when you take back into account what's happening and how you respond. And then each time it's not an escalation or de-escalation, but rather using your critical decision-making skills with every exchange.
Yeah. Great. I also there was also someone from the States, I think Gary Glukowicz, if I pronounce it good. He's an icon in the police communication world. He wrote a book, but he talks. Funny enough, he talks about non-escalation. Uh,
Yes.
and I found it I found it okay. It's about a little bit about language, but
Right.
the fact that if you go in wild into a situation, you already blow up the whole scene. Eh?
Yes.
So that
Yes.
yeah.
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 And we have a term here, a slang term that's
Mm.
used, lawful but awful. I don't know if you've heard that or if your
No.
listeners have heard that. But what that means is it's a use of force that's legally justified, but it's awful. It's lawful, but it's
Mm.
awful. Meaning that the way that the law enforcement officer has handled the situation, they've almost created a self-jeopardy,
Yeah,
right? Where now they have nothing else to respond to except
exactly.
with use of force because of the steps along the way. So if you look at just that use of force, just that incident,
Yeah,
it's legal,
yeah,
but could it have been prevented? Is there a
yeah,
way that it didn't get to that step?
yeah, that's important.
And
Yeah.
that's, and so those are the types of things for police executives that are particularly problematic. Because when you're reviewing a use of force case, how do you take those steps into account when you're judging the behavior of the officer at the final stage?
Yeah,
Right? Where do we fit in an expectation
yeah.
that you're using non-escalation or de-escalation tactics
Mm.
along the way? How do we train that? And then how do we make sure that we're reinforcing that those are our expectations? And then finally, how do we get our first line supervisors involved to
Yeah.
make sure that that messaging is clear to officers and that they realize that using those tactics and skills doesn't mean that they're going to be less safe. It means that they're going to be more safe.
You also wrote an article about in the line of in the about supervisors.
I did, yes.
I prepared a question for that, and based on the training, you yeah. What is it about police supervisors? How
Yeah,
important are they
yeah.
in this?
So I'm so glad that you asked that because um, first line supervisors, so sergeants and lieutenants in most of the US agencies. So just literally your first line of supervision. From my perspective, those officers are the most critical in any police department.
Mm.
Anything that you as a police executive want to accomplish or change or do in your agency funnels through those officers. And for the first line, the officers, what we have found time and time again is that officers want to please their supervisors. They want to do well. They want to make sure that they are prioritizing their work according to the expectations of their first line supervisors. But oftentimes, what the officers think the priorities are and what the supervisors tell you their priorities are don't match.
Uh-huh.
So there's a communication gap. That's something I found actually in the 1990s. I'm dating myself here when I wrote a dissertation on first line supervision.
Uh-huh.
So for me, everything comes back to those first line supervisors. When we were looking at the impact of the de-escalation training with the Louisville Metro Police Department, we also looked at those first line supervisors to see what they were doing or not doing to support de-escalation tactics. And one of the things that we found is that officers' receptivity to the training is one of the most important aspects of whether or not they use it.
Yeah.
Okay. But also, they're more likely to be receptive if they believe their first line supervisor is receptive.
Oh.
So the perception that first line supervisors support de-escalation training is one of the strongest predictors of whether or not the officers themselves actually use it in the field. And that was so striking to me because this is something we can change this right away. Right? We can think about what the training needs to be for those first line supervisors, about how after an interaction, they come in and debrief and work with those officers to encourage the types of behaviors that they would like to see, how they can informally change the trajectory of a lot of those encounters just through identifying who's doing well, who needs additional training, how can we help these first line folks. And I'll just give you a stat here because I'm a researcher, so I need to do that just once or twice during our talk.
Great.
Officers who were the most receptive to the ICAT training had about a 50% probability of reporting that they were using the skills in their most recent encounter with someone in crisis. But the officers that were the least receptive had a 4.5% probability of using the tactics and skills they were trained on. Supervisors, we know, can change that. They can change officers' receptivity. And that's why it's so critical that these trainings are not a check the box exercise, that they're holistic in nature, that they attach to your policies, but also to your first line supervisors. Really critical.
So do you mean also that if you run a de-escalation training program, you need the first line supervisors to be there, or do they also need another kind of training, extra training, or what?
They need both. So they need to see and understand how those officers are being trained. And they need to be trained because sometimes they respond to scenes too, right? So you don't want to neglect the fact that they need to have those de-escalation tactics and skills available and ready. So they need to be trained with the overall training. But in addition to that, there are things that the agency can do to help promote and put in place systems for first line supervisors to help encourage the use of these de-escalation tactics and skills. That's the next part. And we'll be working with supervisors. I'm so excited. We're starting a consortium of first line supervisors to work on a whole host of issues. We've got about 50 agencies or so that they've promised to send me their very best supervisor. One from each agency where we can talk about what do you need, what tools, resources, checklists, training during roll calls. What can we do? What can we build to help you to reinforce all of the principles for best practices, including, in this case, de-escalation during encounters with citizens?
So back to ICAT, the program you tested and with great results. Can you just for for police trainers here in the Netherlands or abroad. Can you give me some things? What is the program all about? What kind of skills do they learn? And can you
Sure,
elaborate a little bit on
sure.
that?
Sure, I will. Now keep in mind, okay, so I've been through ICAT training myself and with other officers. I've viewed it many times, but I'm not a sworn officer and I'm also not a trainer. So you should follow up and have the trainers come on and talk to you about what they do and how they accomplish this. But I can tell you about that training specifically. It's a day and a half, sometimes 2 days of training. The most, I believe, critical part of the training is the hands-on experiential learning piece where they actually practice scenarios. So the question now becomes like, can you do that through VR training? Does it have, can you simulate these? Do you need actors for role play? Like, how is the best way to give that experiential learning
Hmm.
to practice the tools and resources and all of the things that you're learning on day one? How do you practice that? And then we also, as a researcher, I worry and think about dosage. How often do you have to train? Is there training decay? And we found that actually in Louisville Metro, that 4 to 6 months after the training, we found that some of the core concepts were starting to decay.
Yeah.
And the officers themselves were requesting to have more training
Mm.
or to have, an additional, a booster training.
Yeah.
What does that look like? Here in the US, and I think you folks have the same issues with recruitment and retention of officers. And you probably, if you're like the US, you're short staffed. You don't have enough officers for everything you need to do. So to pull them out
Yeah.
and put them in training is really a burden on
Yeah.
all of the calls for service and all the other work that you're doing in the organization. So how much training do we need without disrupting police operations
Yeah.
to accomplish that training? So these are all the things that we're now testing across the country.
Great.
And it's not just me. Now
Of
there's
course.
like a whole group of folks that are really interested in helping the police to sort that out. So what each training curricula looks like, and I've been talking a lot about about ICAT training,
Yeah.
but there's dozens, more than that probably, of types of de-escalation or conflict resolution training that's offered in the US. Some are better than others, right? But the core concepts of them sometimes don't even match, to be honest.
Mm.
So it's like
And
we refer to as the wild, wild west
yeah.
of training.
And if a police trainer or a professional is interested in like the content of ICAT, can they find it? Like what kind of
Yes.
communication
Yep.
skills do
They can
they
find it
learn?
right now. They can
Ah,
find it right now. Perf has made their materials available publicly.
uh-huh.
So if you go to their website or you Google ICAT, you can find it. They also train. They have, I believe it's through the end of this year, and I hope that they'll continue it. But this entire year, they created a facility in Decatur, Illinois, and any police personnel that can get there, right? They have to pay their way there, but then the training's free.
Mm.
So, and it's a train the trainer program. So they are training other trainers
Yeah.
to be able to go back to your agency. But they have, yes, they've made that so that it's publicly available, and they're very responsive if trainers have questions or trying to better understand how that curriculum's built or put together. They're available for that.
Based upon your experience and your research, do you think that de-escalation training programs are context specific to a degree in the sense that is it different in the Netherlands than in the US? Is it different maybe even in different states or what? Or are they just universal principles of active listening or whatever
Yeah. Yeah.
that work everywhere?
That's such a great question. And as an academic, right, we're testing that in different environments. What does this look like? But my hunch is, and again, it's not backed by science just yet. But my sense is that the core principles will hold regardless of the specifics of the setting. And the reason is because we're trying to teach officers about decision making and decision making processes so that they're learning to take in everything around their environment. But they also know ahead of time what other resources are available, what are, that they're thinking through the situations before they come to the call, right? That on the route, they're already
Yeah.
mentally preparing and thinking through all of their decision-making options before they arrive on scene. So I think those core ideas will absolutely translate
Yeah.
across international contexts, and even for us, regional contexts, urban, rural, et cetera. When you're teaching officers good decision-making skills, and you're teaching them to look and think about time, distance, cover, resources, all of those things ahead of time, I believe that can only make everyone safer in these encounters.
Yeah. Great. And now I've got my question because I was a little bit caught up in the decision making uh, decision making part. But uh, I forgot my question. No, I just popped up in my head, which it is not relevant for this discussion, but I was interested in if you use a particular decision-making model or Kahneman or Klein or what. Did you do research into decision-making
Yeah.
also?
Well, we're just starting some of that. Now,
Ah,
understanding the different decision-making models is a little bit more complicated
yeah.
because how do you test it?
Yes.
Right? If it's attached to a training, is it the decision-making model that's really having the impact, or is it the practice of the specific tactics and
Yeah.
skills? Like, we can't separate it out.
True. Yeah.
But I can tell you that any strong or good uh, de-escalation training, anything worth its salt, is going to have some way to train about officer decision making, and hopefully get us out of the mindset of the hierarchical modeling of, use of force. This is how I react. This is how, and that
Yeah.
up, because it's easy to escalate, really hard to de-escalate when
Yeah.
you're using use of force curricula or use of force continuum models.
There was beautiful research. I thought I just probably I posted it from Judith Anderson and Paula Di Nota from Toronto University. They had an article about visual models and use of force.
Oh, great. Well, I would love to
Yeah,
take a look at it because that's a real critical issue.
yeah,
The other thing I can mention to you too, there's a group of researchers loosely affiliated with the University of South Carolina. There's a group of them, they're all at different places. But they've been doing work in this area, and they are now looking at the body cam footage
yeah,
to start quantifying and testing out how the interaction unfolds in time and space. So I think that's going to be very valuable research moving forward.
yeah.
And then the University of Chicago, their crime lab has been working on a new training that they've developed, and it's on decision making
Mm,
for their officers and first line supervisors, I believe, are part of that too. And they're finding really good results out of that. They've just released those findings in the last few months.
great.
So those are sources where for folks
Yeah,
that are listening should go and look up. So University of Chicago, some of the work coming out of the University of South Carolina as well. Those are places to pay attention with what's happening.
and say for example you are a police trainer, or even you are in a police training department, and you have some idea about how de-escalation training looks like.
Mhm.
Maybe you went to the perf site and so on. Do you
Mhm.
have any advice how to implement it? Because, for example, recently, 2 weeks ago, I gave a whole a course or a whole day on the police academy, and they loved it and they liked it and they etc etc. But as usual, there is no time, no money, no
Right.
there is pushback and so on. So, but what did you learn about having a good idea and then how to implement it?
Yes, that's really critical too. I can tell you actually some folks out of the University of Arizona, or no, I'm sorry, it's Arizona State University. There's a big difference there, and they would be upset that I mixed that up. But out of ASU, Michael White, he worked with the Tempe, Arizona Police Department as they were developing their own curricula. Right? So some people take curriculum off the shelf, right? Something that's already been produced and they just want to have it implemented in their agencies. Other agencies take a look around at what everyone else is doing and then they custom build their own training. So he worked with an agency that did that custom build and then we're testing it along the way. One of the things that I can recommend very strongly, whatever training you decide to do, hook up with a local researcher and test along the way. The importance of that, I cannot describe to you how important it is because you learn not just did it work or not, but along the way you can make corrections or modifications or emphasize particular topics more that might be getting lost in translation.
Yeah.
After we did the Louisville Metro study, we took the findings back to the Police Executive Research Forum for the ICAT training, and we showed like, hey, this works. That's great. But we also found these other areas where it could be better, or there are problems. There's training decay in these areas. They took that information and then they changed and updated their curricula, right?
Yeah,
So we're in a constant feedback loop because I truly believe that our men and women that are out there doing this work, they deserve the very best training we have. And
absolutely.
it's up to us to make sure that it is the very best training and that it's constantly evolving and being updated to keep officers and the public they serve safe. I can think of no greater calling for a researcher to be able to be a part of that and to help in some way. So I hope that you have researchers that are listening to this as well, and not just your trainers and law enforcement officers, because we have a role to play and you need to step up and do that and
Yeah.
help folks along the way with the skill sets that you have.
And talking about researchers, I did study at university, but I'm not a researcher, so you know what I mean.
Mhm.
So I do not, I'm not doing any research. But yesterday I talked with Bill Lewinsky from For Science, and we came a little bit to the conclusion that we publish, you can publish a lot of papers, but not
That's
every
right.
officer is reading it.
Of course not.
And what can we do? Can we what can we do better as researchers?
Yes.
Or is it not our?
It is on us. And I have to say, I've been very hard on my colleagues in the research world because we write papers for other academics to read.
Yeah,
We don't put it in plain language. It's not translatable a lot of times. And even where it's published in the US, it's behind paywalls. You can't
yeah,
even access the research for the field. What are we doing? Why would we do that? Do you not want to have your work have impact in the real world? It's mind blowing to me. I just cannot understand it. So I think that it's on the researchers to make sure when they're partnering with an agency and an agency is willing to take them in and expose themselves, right, to this type of critique, if you will,
yeah,
they have a responsibility as a partner to frame that research as a way to help and not critique. And when the findings are available, as quickly as you can, get that information into the practitioner's hands so that they can use it. And we need to do a much, much better job of doing that. And you mentioned that you're not a researcher. Well, we'd call you a pracademic, right? A
yeah,
practitioner academic. You're a pracademic, and you're actually one of the most important pieces because you're the link
yeah,
between folks like me and folks that are actually doing the work in the field. And so your role doing things exactly like this, having both researchers and trainers come on and speak about these types of topics is so incredibly important for us to be able to work together to get this
Yeah.
right. And I should have mentioned, you'd mentioned Force Science a couple of times. They also have a couple of different de-escalation trainings.
Yeah.
One is, I think, realistic de-escalation
Correct.
is
Yeah.
theirs. They have a couple of others as well. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of curricula out there.
Yeah.
I don't want to suggest that one is better than another, but you should test it
Yeah.
in your agencies to make sure it's meeting the needs for your officers.
Yeah. Great. I would love to hear you at the end of our conversation about something about doing research. There is a lot of we talk in the Netherlands a lot about evidence-based
Mhm.
training, evidence-informed training, and so on. But as a researcher, what is what is science? It sounds a little bit philosophical, but what I mean, what is the scientific method for you, and can you explain it in layman terms so that also trainers and officers can understand what are we doing and why do we call it science?
Right.
It
Well, that's a huge, you've opened up a huge
yeah.
Pandora's box
Yeah, I know.
of what is science, but I can tell you what it means for me. Um, so many times in very critical spaces like policing, right? I can think of no other area that is so critically important in terms of interacting and changing people's lives, being able to detain individuals, take their liberty, even take their life. There's no greater place for science than to help with those really challenging decision-making processes, right? And so, and the only other space I think that is that critically important is educating our children, right?
Yeah,
So in the space of education too, right? Like these are core fundamental pieces of our government, of our democracies to get this right. Science is is no more to me than testing to help take those principles and make sure that we're doing the very best job that we can. There are some scientific methods that are stronger than others, right? If I could put you all in a test tube in a lab, I would, and we'd figure it out. But that's not the real world. So, as a researcher working with police agencies, I have to make sure that I'm not interrupting the operations of the organization, but that I'm still putting the strongest research design in place so that I can give back the best information. And that's a careful balancing act. And you have to, as someone outside the police, you have to show your value.
yeah,
You have to demonstrate to your partners that your purpose is not to expose or critique or, do damage, but your role is to support and encourage and help move forward in productive ways. For me, that's the science piece that I hope that more researchers bring to the table when they're partnering with law enforcement
yeah.
agencies.
Great. And for me, science and the scientific method, I would love to hear your feedback on that. It's also about having a mindset of testing your assumptions and being
Yeah,
open and transparent about it, and also the how do you call it, the willingness to rethink
right,
your opinions. And when I was a police trainer, I did a lot of micro experiments. I just tested it out, and we have an assumption. Let's test it out. Let's do
right,
it, and
right.
let's change our thoughts. And that worked beautifully.
Yes, it is that neutral mindset, right? That
Yeah,
when I first worked with my colleagues at the University of Cincinnati to set up this de-escalation evaluation of the training, when we set that up, I said to myself, it does not matter what the findings show, regardless, they will be important. If this study had shown that officers were at more risk or that there was no change at all, that citizens were still having force used against them at the same level, anything like that, that's still critical information to get out
yes,
there. Because if we continue to invest money and resources and time into things that don't work, that's just as important to know.
Yeah.
It's not about blaming individuals, but it's about being able to pivot and change course. De-escalation training was one that we found an effect for, and that's great. We
Yeah.
also tested implicit bias training.
Yeah.
We did
Oh.
not find that it was
Oh.
effective. And we put those results out there.
Yeah.
And that's what good scientists do.
What is your ambition for the coming years?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm back to academia, which is great. So I'm at
Yeah.
Ohio State now,
Uh-huh.
and I'm going back to working directly with agencies. So we have some de-escalation training evaluations that are in the field right now. They'll be
Mm-hmm.
coming out in the next few months, actually. We'll have some new findings,
Mm.
work that we've been doing. But I really want to work with first line supervisors. I think that is the biggest untapped potential
Yeah.
for change and innovation in law enforcement and in police agencies around the world, for that matter. So I want to learn what's working for first line supervisors, not just in de-escalation training, of course, but in everything, right?
Yeah.
So what's working for them? What models can we use? I hope to come and visit you folks. I'd love to see
Yeah.
what you all are doing.
Yeah.
We learn our best ideas from other places, right? So
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
want to come and see, how do you train your first line supervisors? What tools and resources do they use? How are they connected with their subordinate officers? All of
Yeah.
those things.
Great.
So that's what I'm really excited about. The final thing I'll just note that I'm very interested in is when you train individuals in conflict resolution tactics, do they then use it internally in their agency,
Mm.
right? Are they using it at home? Is it improving their well-being in their lives, right? Because officer safety wellness is so critically important too.
Yeah.
So is this something where we can teach good decision-making skills that will then expand beyond an interaction between an officer and a citizen and
Great.
into, so this is such a sometimes dangerous but often uh, emotionally draining and stressful profession. Can we better equip our officers to deal with those critical incidents that they're undoubtedly going to encounter someplace in their career and help them to be better and well? So
Yeah.
those are things I'm interested in.
Great. Well, you seem to be very driven.
I'm
Just,
passionate
yeah,
about it.
yeah,
I certainly am.
yeah. Great, great to hear. And last question, and maybe I surprise you with the question, but uh, is there a book, article, podcast, video you can recommend with regard to police
Oh,
work, de-escalation, or
gosh, there's so
so
many.
many? What is the
Well,
greatest
I mean,
book?
there's a lot of work in this space. I don't know that I would tie it specifically to de-escalation. I would
No.
certainly say, take a look at all the different work that's happening. I'm trying to put together right now, just like we did in 2015, we did an assessment, systematic review
Yeah,
of what we knew. I'm going to be doing that again this spring. I've been asked to update it, so I'm going to do that again. So that's something that I'll
yeah,
certainly come back to you with and put out there. But there's lots of interesting, great podcasts that are being done. I would say I'm most interested in the ones that bring the officers together with researchers. When you
uh-huh.
have just one or the other, you're missing the
Yeah.
pieces.
Well, thank you so much for your service and
Oh,
uh,
thank you.
and all the things you do. Did I forget something?
I don't think so. We have Thanksgiving coming up here in
Uh-huh.
just a couple of days. Here in the US, it's our day to give thanks and gratitude. And I will just say that I am grateful and thankful for all of our first responders and for the community members that step up and work with them, to make our communities safer for all. I'm very, very grateful for that every day, but especially this week when we have an opportunity to think about that gratitude piece. And
Yeah,
the final thing I'll
absolutely.
just note is I had an officer that intervened early in my lifetime,
Mm.
when I was very young, and that changed the course of my life. We had a very troubled home. And it was really the decisions that officers make every single day impact lives, and they may not know for 40, 50 years down the road what that
Yeah,
really meant to someone. And
great.
I appreciate that every day.
Wow, thank you so much. And that's today it's International Day against violence against women and girls.
Wow.
So also there are um,
Yes, it's so important.
yeah,
In the US, when I was growing up, domestic violence was a private matter.
yeah,
And it took a pretty brave officer to
wow,
intervene and say, this is no longer a private matter,
yeah,
and change the course of my life and that of
yeah,
my mother and my siblings.
wow,
And so, again, every day officers
yeah,
have that impact somewhere, right? And it's amazing the impact that they can have. So I'm
yeah.
grateful.
Great. Thank you so much. We will end this conversation, and I would like to say you goodbye offline.
Very good. Thank
So
you.
thank you so much for listening, and I will put the articles and so on in the show notes. So thank you, and all officers, thank you for your service. Bye bye.